He would literally just eviscerate people in meetings all of the time. I mean, everybody was basically running scared. And then what happened was that nobody wanted to be called out in the meeting for making the slightest mistake. So people were pointing fingers, people were backstabbing each other just because they didn't want to face his wrath. I mean, that is the epitome of a horrible boss.
You have a PhD in engineering, is that correct?
That is correct.
That's amazing. And you were in the Navy and have seen a plethora of bad boss behaviors, experiences. We're going to get into all of that. Now you own your own company. And I think all of the things that you've done are just amazing and more great things in the future, of course, too. So share a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. So starting off, I am an engineer. I am like an engineer's engineer. I've been engineering since I was a little girl. I used to build Barbie houses instead of actually play with them. And I got my engineering degree at Texas A&M. It was an ocean engineering degree. But then I decided, you know what? I want to go to the United States Navy because the Navy had this small group of civil engineers that would go all over the world and they would build. And that's what I did. So right after school, I went out and I was stationed in Guam, Alaska, Japan, and I got to build during all of these times. Several years later, I got out of active duty because my husband went into the FBI and we were stationed in San Francisco. There was no active duty anywhere. I went back to school, and that's when I got my master's and PhD in engineering. And it has just been absolutely so much fun. The only thing is that I just kept getting called back to active duty several times. So I went to Iraq, and then I was a commanding officer of a battalion of 800 people when I went to Afghanistan. I've also had the ability to go to Fiji several times. We need to build on Fiji, apparently. So I got to go there. Through all of this, whenever I was going on active duty, off active duty, I had several bad bosses, and I started to look around at some of my counterparts who were independent contractors, and they were doing really well. And I thought, you know what, I can do this too. And I did. So finally, in 2017, I decided, you know what, I'm going to start my own company. And I did, and it's been going great since.
Wow, that's an amazing story. And the background and you being in the Navy, it makes a lot of sense now, the deep ocean blue. I love that. And I love how you found carved out your own path as a leader, regardless of the experiences that you had to in dealing with some really bad bosses. What were those boss behaviors like? Do any particularly stick out to you, or any kind of stories that you can share without, we don't want to name call, of course, but any moments that stick out as a good example of bad boss behavior?
Probably the worst boss I've ever had. He was a yeller and he yelled at everybody all the time. He used to say, "Don't mistake my yelling for anger, make it passion." And I'm like, yeah, that's not the same thing. But I mean, he would literally just eviscerate people in meetings all of the time. I mean, everybody was basically running scared. And then what happened was that nobody wanted to be called out in the meeting for making the slightest mistake. So people were pointing fingers, people were backstabbing each other just because they didn't want to face his wrath. I mean, that is the epitome of a horrible boss.
Yeah. And what do you think was the reasoning behind that for him? Did he ever have a moment of realization, or did you have an epiphany after the fact and understand where maybe it was coming from? Did he have people above him yelling and shouting at him, or was it really just plain and simple, that's who he was and he wasn't going to change?
It's probably how he was brought up. But I would also say that's also who he was. I talked to several people who had known him through his career, and they said, yeah, this is the way that he is, and this is the way he's probably always going to be. And it was really pretty sad because served with somebody. So, people rotate. The person right before him, man, she was fantastic. She was so good to work with. She would listen to you, she would take your ideas. She was a great leader. And then all of a sudden we get this guy who just doesn't want to listen to anybody. It's always his way. There's no other way. And, if you mess up in the slightest, you're probably going to get fired. I mean, it was just, but people told us coming in, they're like, hey, this guy's coming in, watch your back. I mean, that's what kind of reputation he had.
That really shuts down any kind of resourcefulness, innovation, problem solving, and if you're was this in the Navy?
Yeah, so this was in Afghanistan.
Wow, so if you're in high stakes, high stress, pressure, and you're still engineering at the same time, as I understand, so not only are you in that kind of environment, but then you're also trying to build, it does not make for a very conducive collaborative environment or experience.
No,
Wow.
it was very, very stressful. It was one of those I got done with that tour and I was completely hollowed out.
And you're in a situation too where, I don't wanna assume, but maybe there is a way to give feedback, but there's nothing really you can do about it. You're kind of stuck. And a lot of folks that I've talked to, they are able to kind of quickly get out of that situation, or this podcast is a good, sort of guide and encouragement for folks, especially folks that I've mentored who are able to get out of that situation relatively quickly or recognize that they need to. But you're kind of stuck in that because you have to serve and you have a limit on your time with that person. So maybe there's a little bit of relief down the road, but how do you navigate that knowing that there's almost nothing you can do?
It was pretty tough, but the way that I looked at it is like, I'm gonna have to deal with this person for probably the next 5 months of my life. But then I also started to look around at how he was treating others. They were a lot lower ranked. They had smaller units than I did, but somehow he was over those also. And, he was just yelling at these people. And I realized that's not the way that you bring people up. You need to mentor them. You need to give them encouragement. Yeah, they're going to screw up, but you need to, not just yell at them. And so what I did was I'm actually proud of what I did, but it was probably more stressful is what I did is I just subsumed those folks under my own command. And so I became an umbrella for them. And I thought, you know what, I can handle it. Let me take care of these guys, and when they screw up, I'll take the heat for it. But what I'll do is I'll help them and train them to be better so that we're not just, creating more people like him.
Yeah.
I'd rather create people who are a lot more conscious and self-aware in their leadership. And so that's what I did. And so I kind of brought more heat on myself during this time. But at the same time, I felt like at the end, it's like, hey, I probably helped several other leaders maybe try to be a little bit better and learn something while we were out there.
That's a great example of leadership, Jen, and I'm sure that was difficult getting the brunt of all that on you. At the same time, I'm sure the people that you're working alongside, they must have looked up to you and been extremely grateful for that and being able to take that burden on so graciously too. What has that sort of shown you now as a leader in your company and owning a company, caring for people? Have you carried that through and trained other managers and leaders?
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest lessons that I learned is I would start to dissect, how this leader was reacting to different things. And what I would do is I would think about, okay, how would I react in that same situation? And then I would quiz my own leadership, below me and say, how would you react if this happened to you? What would be your immediate response? Because a lot of times, there's nothing new under the sun. Something is going to happen. It's going to be very similar to a situation you previously have been in. And I'll tell you, there were times when things went, way sideways. And us like, I just had to think about, okay, how am I going to react to this? Because a lot of times our initial reaction is anger or we want to lash out or something like that. And I would just think about it and I would school myself and say, no, that's how he would react. I've already thought about this. This is how I want to react. And so I would basically, sit down with my leadership and say, this is what happened. I want you to really start to think about how you are going to react in these type of situations because you will be in these situations at some point within your career. And that's how I actually think you can learn sometimes more from bad bosses than you can from good bosses. And that's
Absolutely.
that's that's actually kind of sad in a way, but yeah, man, you can learn a lot from bad bosses. As long as you take that information in and you synthesize it and you really think about how do I want to lead in these situations.
Definitely. You're so right. And that's part of the purpose of this podcast is to give some gentle understanding that we're all human. We've all probably made a mistake and will make a mistake in the future. But if we can learn from those that went before us and whatever their faults, they're human too, and they can at least show us what not to do. It gives a way better guide than making that mistake yourself and having to go through that process, I've certainly found. And, hopefully we're not making the same or greater mistakes. I don't want to be the judge of that. But, at the same time, demonstrating great leadership, but teaching it like you're sharing is, I think, equally important because what you're doing is you're taking your people through scenarios that they might experience and getting their thought process and the decision making. And oftentimes I feel like, folks don't always have that sort of thought process of how I'm going to think through how to handle a situation and giving themselves a framework or frameworks for that. So I think that's really smart and great of you to think through with people how they might handle and what would they do because it gives them a practice arena area first before you actually get into the situation and potentially make a misstep that you regret. So, very wise of you. What are some other areas in bad boss behavior that you've experienced that were either very jarring and that you had to navigate and that you would say, maybe I asked a guest this the other day, but what were the top 3 bad boss behaviors that they experienced and hated? Yelling we can put as number 1, but were there any others that really stuck out to you as like a, "This is the lesson I learned never to do this, and here's how I approach it now."
I did have a boss that lied. So he didn't want to take credit for something that he had done. And so he let me take all the blame for it. So that wasn't a big, motivator to really ever help him again. This was out in the civilian world, and I just was kind of shocked by his whole behavior. And I've just found so many other, people not trusting their people and micromanaging. And so I'd say that, probably the micromanaging is probably number 3 and just not being truthful as the number 2. And so yeah, I've run across all different types of bad bosses, and that's probably some of the biggest issues that I found.
Those are some really, really key core, I would say, behaviors that are really incredibly important. You have to have trust. You have to let people take ownership. So I'm glad you mentioned those. One thing that does come up is that understanding of being a micromanager versus holding people accountable. I read something the other day about how accountability needs to start with ourselves, which maybe to us talking here makes a lot of sense and it's a no brainer. But for others out there, especially folks who are getting into management and they're very green at it, regardless of their experience, they struggle with learning what is the difference between micromanaging behavior and letting someone take ownership and still holding them accountable to that without nitpicking every detail. So, do you have a way you could summarize that for us or explain at least what you see as micromanaging?
Absolutely. Because there was a time in my life when I was a micromanager. Um, and I got called on it. And then that's when it put it into the forefront of my mind. I was like, oh man, oh, I get it now. And
Yeah.
so I can explain sort of like what I had to do to not be a micromanager. And it really started with just trusting a little bit and just giving a small problem to somebody and just seeing if they could do it. And it was really hard to sit back and kind of like hold on to the chair and not go check on them like every 5 minutes. Hey, how are you doing? Do you need help? But just letting them do it. And then also just talking with them and understanding it's like, what are their capabilities? What are their abilities? What have they done before? Have they even done this task? And really getting an understanding of who they are and what they can do. And then kind of measuring their level of excitement about it. I know that might sound kind of silly, but saying, hey, I want to give this to you. What do you think? And it was really one of those times in my life when I had to just sort of like sit on my hands and let it go and just say, "Hey, can you come and let me know how things go at the end of the day?" That way, instead of me going to them, they're working on it and they're coming to me and I said, I'd say, "Hey, if you have a question or something like that, come talk to me." But I had to basically just, like let go. And that was so hard. But then once I kinda got the hang of it and once I understood them a lot better and what they could do, and yeah, they messed up, but, they would come and say, "Hey, here's where I am. I needed help over this," and so I'd kind of try my best to sort of guide them and pull answers out of them so that
Mhm.
they started to think through the process as opposed to me just saying, go do this. Then I found that they were able to change their thought patterns, then they would be better at trying to solve them. And I found that, and I learned that from a mentor of mine. And so once I started to do that, people were starting to be better at problem solving. And yeah, of course, people are going to mess up. And the biggest thing is to not start at square one. Talk to them, sit down with them, kind of look through everything, have them understand, and then, say, hey, go try it again, and let them. Because, as leaders, like we can't do everything. And that's what I found is like I was trying to do everything. I was burning myself out. And, people want to do things. They want to be great. And we have to try to let them.
Absolutely. I love that, Jen. I love again that you referenced the coaching. And if you're like me, I love the Socratic method of asking questions to get the thoughts. Not that I necessarily know where we're going to end up, but it helps people think through a process, a procedure, the thought process of what you're doing. And I feel like you're saying too is that you're also training the person in that task. You're not letting them necessarily go off on their own unsupported, but you're letting them do it on their own and take ownership versus you watching over like a hawk and making sure that it gets done. And then, on the other side of that too is the accountability. So when you do give someone a task and if they follow through and follow up, that's great. They are accountable. But what happens when somebody you do trust them with a task, you've given them the adequate support that they need and then they fail you in some kind of way, whether it's small or large, how do you hold them accountable? Am I even phrasing that in an unhelpful way? Is it more so throughout the process, people are maybe dropping the ball or not up to the task that you've provided for them?
I would say there's a couple different things you can do. Maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal for them, but I would say like those daily check-ins. Like for me, that's sort of like a hurdle. Like, let's get over this hurdle. And if they don't make it over the hurdle, then, I'll give them a little bit of time and I'll come to them and say, hey, this is one of the things that we talked about, how are things going? And, maybe they forgot, maybe they're embarrassed, maybe something went wrong and they don't want to come talk to me. And so that's another part is like you have to be approachable. You had to have that two-way communication because whenever they screw up, you want them to be able to come to you and not snap their heads off. And so that's also like you have to be approachable to them so that they feel comfortable. And I would just go up and say, "Hey, where are you at? What can I help you with?" And try to get them, kind of back on that track again. If it's happening over and over and over again, then maybe it's time to scale back whatever that task was to make it more manageable maybe for them. And that's something that you have to talk to them about. And that's hard. I say, hey, I don't think that this is maybe the right task for you. Is there something else that maybe we could put you on? Or, hey, let's just scale it back. And maybe there's something going on in their personal life. You never know. There's all kinds of things that are going on. But if you don't talk to your people and you just assume that they're not doing something because maybe they just can't, you know, nobody wants to assume anything. Always, always, always talk to your people, find out what's going on with them, and then you're going to have to make the decisions to decide if you're going to go forward or if you need to go in a different direction or if you have to scale back.
Yeah, that's tough too. That's where the difficult conversations come in, right? And how do you know, especially now owning a company and having people report to you and maybe they're reporting to other managers too. How do you know when you've sort of come to maybe it's a crossroads or maybe it's the limit that that person has in their ability to do their job in a way that is according to their essential job duties or what you've outlined for them and you just keep hitting that wall with them. How do you navigate that? How do you know when it's time to maybe part ways and separate from that person? Because I think it can be really challenging, especially for middle managers to know what that kind of level of escalation is for maybe a lot of us who are wanting to help people and extend ourselves. We have to know what's the limit? How far do we go before we recognize that there's not really much more that we can do for this person?
One thing I would say is, and this is something I learned in the military, is document.
Mm,
Maybe it's something that you put in your desk and, in a drawer or something like that, like, hey, this is once you start to see a pattern, like this person is hitting a wall, start to maybe document this, like, hey, this is where, on this day, this is what happened. It's your own little journal, it's your own little backup. It'll help a lot. Go and talk to that person. And again, I'm like I said, I'm a big believer in just going and talking to the person. And those are hard. Sometimes it's over Zoom, sometimes it's in person, whatever that might be. And just find out, it's like, look, if this is, the limit, we're actually requesting you to do this. And if it's not, then maybe this is not a good fit. And then hear their side of the story. Maybe there's, the way that I look at it also, this is also kind of from my military training. A lot of times when people fail, a lot of times it's on us. Like almost 50% of the time, it's maybe on us. Maybe we were not giving them the right training to do what needed to be done, or maybe we didn't give them enough time. A lot of times we need to look at what we're doing in order to help that person. And if we have exhausted everything, like we've given them the world and they still can't do what needs to be done, I would say, this is just not working out. We really thank you, but maybe this is not the position for you. And boy, that's hard. But before you do anything like that, you need to make sure that you have exhausted everything that you could have done. And you have all of this paperwork also, to say, hey, you know what? These are all the times that, we've had problems, and it can't be a surprise to the person. If it cannot ever be a surprise. You should have gone through and had these discussions, quite often.
That's a great rule of thumb guideline, Jen, that it shouldn't be a surprise, and equally documenting, because I've definitely seen how having really accurate, up-to-date internal records can help you avoid the back and forth, he said, she said, or any kind of defensiveness that can creep up. And then also approaching that conversation and being open to listening too, because I'm sure our default might be to just get through and move on and not hear the other person. But it is really important to have that transparency and let them know what's going on from your observation and what you're seeing, and then giving them a chance to respond to that. I imagine for the other person, it's a little bit easier to hear that conversation too, rather than simply coming at them and throwing all of your documentation and the book at them, so to speak. Yeah.
Everybody who I've had to let go, and it's not very many. I mean, they knew that it was coming. So good or bad, at least it wasn't a surprise. I didn't like show up and give them their severance pay and say goodbye. They knew that they weren't living up to what they could, and so like I said, everybody I've had to let go, they knew that it was coming.
That shows great communication too, in the sense that whether, it's an unfortunate kind of communication that has to occur, but you as a leader were communicating and offering clarity and expectations, and they could see and realize that they were not meeting those. And so communication, I think that plays a core part in everything we do in life, but especially in leadership. And it's also part of that trust building. And I know you have some thoughts on how to build trust and how to build a spirit of collaboration with your team and with your company. Where does that start? Especially if you're the owner, the leader at the top, where does that start for you? And how do you ensure that it's continued throughout everyone in the company, whether you're the one leading the team directly or you have managers in place to lead small teams, large teams? How do you ensure that that stays alive and vibrant?
It has to start small. A lot of people do have problems with trust, and I would just say, just start small. One small little task, then start to grow from there. And it's something that the people that I bring on also, they have that same thought process of like, we need to trust people. I don't really hire people who are like, I'm not trusting. I don't like those people. I hate people. I don't hire those kind of people. I want to hire somebody who's like minded. And so if you talk about trust and you show trust, then you start to build it as it goes down. And it's really important to the middle managers. They have a lot of pressure on their shoulders. They have to perform, they have to bring in the projects, they have to do all these things. But if you're showing trust to them, then they know that they're trusted. And it's one of those things where you have to say, hey, sometimes you have to remind them, hey, how are you showing trust to your people? And it's not bad to have a reminder from time to time. And then I start to, every once in a while, just sort of remind them. It's like, have you been in a business relationship where you have not been trusted? Remember what that feels like. And people are like, oh yeah. Oh yeah, that really sucked. I don't want to do that again. And so it's just, just reminding people from time to time. And then once you get that two-way trust going, wow, man, you can do amazing, amazing things because people like showing up for work. People want to show what they can do. People want to try new things and know that you have their back. So people can be more effective and more efficient. And it's a really good place to be.
And you make a great point there too. If you're hiring folks who are of that like-minded collaborative nature, then you're able to create that a little bit easier because everybody's coming to the table with the same positive inclination to trust each other, to be collaborative, and to maintain that moving forward. So that's a great point too, Jen. Or maybe they already are and you want to encourage them to continue further.
I always like to look for the person who's not in it for themselves. I love the person who is trying to develop the people below them. And they put a lot of emphasis on that, making sure they have the right training, make sure they have the right support. And it's not about them anymore. It's about the team and creating great teams. To me, that's the person that I want to promote because I know that wherever you put them, they're going to have that same idea of creating what is the best for everybody and bringing everybody up with them. That's what it's all about. It's those selfless people. Oh, I love those type of people.
Oh, I love that, Jen. I love that you highlight that because that's to me, it's that servant leadership. Talking about it with another guest, the idea of generosity and being generous of spirit with your training and your time with no sort of agenda that is going to necessarily get you anything more than helping others. So I love that you highlight that. Thank you so much. I know we could continue on. We probably need to have another conversation episode at some point, but I want to make sure that people can find you online, Jen, connect and learn a little bit more about you, maybe even work with you in your company. So, what's the best way that they can reach out and get to know you better and connect?
Probably the easiest way is through LinkedIn. And so I'm Jenn Donahue, I think PhD, PE, but Jenn Donahue, Donahue. Yeah, if you reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'm there, would love to have a conversation with you.
Awesome. Absolutely. We will have that link in the caption below so everybody can reach out to Jen and connect. I know we'll definitely connect, Jen, and already have by the time people are hearing this. But I'm just so grateful for your connection today and all that you shared with us. We really can learn a lot from those bad experiences, and it's how we navigate them and then transform ourselves into great leaders. And recognizing that we can all make mistakes. So I'm glad that you learn from that and we're able to grow from that and share your transformation and how you're inspiring greatness in others. So thank you so much, Jen, for being our guest. And thank you all to our audience for listening to another episode of Bad Bosses, Great Leaders.